big news. Congress just took a big step forward in ending this partial government shutdown, and that is where we're going to start off with today. I'm joined, of course, by producer Sarah Calloway, and then also our political expert here, Dr. Leslie Caughell, joining us. We are so thankful for you to being here this morning, especially after the news that we just learned within the last few hours while people were sleeping. The Senate agreed to fund most of the Department of Homeland Security, except for ICE, and also for parts of Border Patrol as well. But if you're FEMA, if you're TSA, if you're the Coast Guard, good news that you're hearing today.
Yeah, absolutely. And this does something that I think makes it more likely the deal goes through, which is addresses some of the Customs and Border Patrol issues that members of the House had brought up as reasons that they wouldn't be willing to vote for a bill that just removed kind of TSA from the funding fight and the other agencies, but left just alone ICE, right? So they also had some Customs and Border Control questions. So I think they're really getting closer and closer to a deal that seems like it has some very real chance of going through at the House.
You know, it's interesting when you speak about the chances that it will go through the House. We are now waiting for the House to, vote on this, to take up this measure. And then after that, we know that it would go to the president. And I think the timing of all of this is interesting, too, because we just learned, right, over the last 24 hours or so, that the president said he was going to sign an executive order directing the Department of Homeland Security to pay TSA workers as the shutdown has continued. So 2 parts in my question. We'll stick with this one first. Yeah. How much do you think the president stating that had to do with the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate finally reaching a deal?
I mean, to the extent that part of your question is there a little bit of a performance here, right? I think that's, at least that's how I read this particular statement. Just because anything like this is going to be kind of mirrored up in the courts, it's going to breed other controversy. Also, I think there's a question, like, money is a finite thing, and he's involved in a lot of other expenditures, moving money around that have been very expensive, right? So he doesn't have an infinite amount of already appropriated money sitting in accounts that he can move. So my guess is that's probably a clue to us that he's going to sign this bill when it goes through, right? And doesn't really have to do this. So he can look like he was ready to come in and save the day, but that won't really be necessary.
Yeah, the way that I kind of looked at it, too, is that typically what we've seen is that Republican lawmakers have not been willing to move forward unless they knew that the president was going to have the support. You've had several senators, Senator Kennedy out of Louisiana in recent weeks, who said, we had a deal that we then talked to the president, and the president was like, no, I'm not doing that at this time. That was maybe a week and a half ago. So they definitely confer with him for these, so I would imagine he would sign. But my other question that I was alluding to as a part of that, the president in that tweet said he was going to direct the Department of Homeland Security to pay TSA workers, saying that it was going to come out of the funding from that massive spending bill, the big, beautiful bill for this. And I was thinking, okay, can he do that? Or is this something that would have to go through Congress?
So I think this is a question that would likely be adjudicated through the courts, right? But there is some discretion that presidents have once money is allocated to move it around within the parameters of how it's been allocated, right? So if Congress really specifically says, we're giving you $5 million to do this specific thing, it's a lot harder for presidents to move funds. But when you have big kind of block kind of allocations for things like we're giving you $100 million to spend on Department of Homeland Security, then certainly what you see is the executive branch having a lot more priority in spending. Eugene, though, I just want to kind of return to something. You mentioned Senator Kennedy saying, like this is the president and, I would have been willing to vote for this. But as I recall, one of the things he said was something akin to it's the president's prerogative. Right? As part of that statement, like the president gets to decide to do this. And that's such a funny abdication of really what Congress does, which is control the spending. And I bring that up because part of whether or not the president can do this with congressionally allocated funds is whether or not Congress is like, wait a minute, That's our job. That's not what we intended to do, and Congress really pushes back. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you noted particularly Republicans and in Congress have looked toward the president for signals on kind of what they should do, and in that way have been willing to give away a lot of congressional power to the executive with regard to resource allocation, with regard to budgeting and spending.
So, those are excellent points to that. And I have to think at this point, right, when you have this type of stalemate, you have two sides that are trying to win something, right? Whether it's you want to get something out of this or you want to win the public approval, as we continue to get closer and closer to those midterms. There's a lot that's going on right now within our country, of course. Does anyone come out on top? If this deal goes through the way in which it currently is structured, who wins if there is even a winner from the Democrats and the Republicans over a more than 40-day stalemate government shutdown?
Well, I'm going to be Debbie Downer here again and say I think no one is the winner when this is how government's run. But certainly Democrats are getting the opportunity to shape a little bit of a policy area they've been particularly upset about, and that's some of the kind of actions and behaviors around ICE. I think for a lot of Democrats, they view Secretary Noem leaving her position as kind of part and parcel of this entire project, which includes the government shutdown. They look at Senator Mullen, now Secretary Mullen, and think maybe he's going to be better to work with. They got some verbal concessions from him about things like warrants in the hearings, on top of which I think there is a broader consensus now that ICE should not wear masks. Anyway, this will be stuff that they can continue to debate, and they will continue to debate it because they pulled ICE out of the bill, at least in this framing. So I think there are some policy wins and some political wins for Democrats. But again, this isn't really how you want to run government. If you're an American who's been to the airport lately, it's not been particularly enjoyable. If you work for the Coast Guard, I'm sure you're not happy. If you work for TSA, you're not happy. If you're trying to get disaster aid from FEMA, this isn't how this is supposed to go. And the fact that this is the way that we seem to be settling on to get policy concessions to just make the government inoperable is really systematic of a larger kind of failure.
Yeah, the second government shutdown, partial government shutdown in back-to-back years at this point within the administration. It is interesting to me as well, I think, with the bill itself that has been agreed upon. Am I not mistaken that there was a similar deal on the table like 2-3 weeks ago?
Yes, there was. And very quickly after this government shutdown happened, I believe you had me here. And one of the things I said is it's limited. It's probably not going to be something most Americans see right away. But this stuff, as it sits, people don't get paid. It gets more visible. There's more pressure. I think early on in the shutdown, you saw some people floating the idea of breaking ICE out as a way of ending it. But I don't think there was much push because politicians weren't really getting much of a push, right? But 2 weeks ago, they were talking about pretty much this same formulation, absent the inclusion of Customs and Border Patrol as something that would kind of remain unfunded. And the president pretty much came out and said, I'm not signing this. And he pretty much, this isn't verbatim, but was like, I'm not giving the win to Democrats. So I think what you're seeing here is the president's willingness to be like, okay, let's take this fight off the table right now. Or at least this part of this fight.
And how much of that do you think, because typically, the president has shown that when he has a point, when he has something, he wants to really dig his heel and stick with it. How much do you think, if at all, the war with Iran right now and everything that goes with that is playing into, tapping that alongside with what we're seeing at airports? What do you think went into the president's decision ultimately to say, you know what, I need to get this through. I need to take this, as you just said, this portion of the debate off the table?
I'm going to first premise this with I have a really hard time occupying the president's mind in a way where I feel like I can follow the kind of strategic kind of imperatives as he sees them. But I would say, at least from an outsider, looking at how he's responded to things and looking at what's going on around him in his administration, you have to assume there is a lot of really bad, really heavy stuff they are dealing with. They are not getting good news cycles on any issue. It used to be that the issue that Americans trusted President Trump on the most was immigration, and I think the second was the economy. His numbers are in the tank on both of those, and you're seeing splits within his coalition, maybe not members of Congress, but kind of important voices, particularly in kind of right-wing media within the party, kind of splitting with the president on issues around things like the war. So I do think this is damage control. And in a way, this is kind of low-hanging fruit because, as you mentioned, this compromise is something that's been floating around in Congress for a bit, right? He had the ability to do this a couple weeks ago. And maybe if you're in the White House right now, you hope this takes the news cycle today as opposed to questions about what's going on and around.
Yeah, and it also will be interesting where they do land when it comes to ICE and Border Patrol because, as you just said, too, like this has been something that was a part of the last negotiations when it came to the full government shutdown. And then now we're here and, you know, we're in the partial government shutdown, still no real resolve there, too. So it'll be interesting with that and with DHS having a new leader in Markwayne Mullen. So a lot of things have happened just in the last few hours from when we were preparing for what we were originally going to talk about to what we're talking about even now. You were just talking about the kind of optics right now with where things are with the economy, obviously this happening with the shutdown, but then the war as well. I know with the way in which the administration has really been moving forward and wanting to give the, you know, everyone, the Americans say, we have this, we're winning this. I wanted to pick your brain on the messaging that we've received from the administration when it comes to what is actually happening, where we are in the war with Iran. Has anything kind of struck you lately in how they've gone about with the messaging?
Yeah, I think there is something really striking. So first, let's take out the kind of military component of like, is the United States striking targets that they've laid out in Iran? Because I think it's very clear that, at least from a military perspective, the military had plans drafted for this. And they're kind of doing what they were supposed to be doing according to those plans. And well, I'm sure, you know, you misstrike things like that. At least operationally, it doesn't seem that you're getting too much discordant kind of argument on by either party that there's anything militarily that we're doing that suggests like this is a massive mess, right? I think the real question is, what are those military operations embedded in? Strategically, what are we trying to do? Which is really what we're fighting over here. And I don't want to minimize that. Like, I guess that's what war is about. It doesn't matter if you like blow something up, if you have no plan on kind of what that's in service of. I guess, you know, do you know what I'm getting at here? Like, you have to have a point for what you're doing. And what has been really striking to me is I follow a lot of news, and I cannot tell you what I think the ultimate objective is. Coming from the administration, it moves around all the time. Sometimes the president says two things that aren't even cohesive together in the same statement within the same 5 minutes. And you see, I think, Republican members of Congress growing increasingly frustrated with this. So I believe Senator Tillis over the weekend was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows.
He was.
And this was aggravating. He's like, I support the war. That part's not the aggregating part. But he's like, I really don't know why we're doing it. And I'd like to know why we're doing it. I don't know how those things go together, how you can support the thing without understanding the strategic objective. But when you have people in your own party, even though, you know, Senator Tillis isn't always, you know, on President Trump's side. He's certainly more able to criticize him than most. But President Trump is, from various Republicans, getting people coming out of committee hearings going, I don't understand strategically what we're doing. I don't understand the end game. Representative Mace this week was like, we're not putting troops on the ground. She, I think, pretty much led everybody to believe in her statement after kind of a briefing that her understanding was we were preparing to put boots on the ground, and she wanted to come out and say that she was not okay with that. So I think you're really seeing a complete collapse of any messaging strategy here. And, that means nobody really knows what's going on. And I think this is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. This is also going to make it a lot harder for Americans, even Americans who are inclined to support President Trump. And let's be very clear, there are a lot of Americans who don't support President Trump, who don't like the Iranian regime, and would not cry if the regime itself collapsed, right? It's going to make it a lot harder for them to bear any costs of this war. And there are military costs, there already have been, in terms of lives and, just resources put in. But we're going to see economic costs. We're already seeing them. I think gas is maybe $1 more a gallon here than it was before.
Yeah.
That's not an insignificant amount of money, and you might be able to, or be okay paying it a couple times, but 3 months from now, if people are paying $1.50 more for gas, are they going to be okay with it? And the administration, I believe it was reported from one of the major newspapers yesterday, that they're contingency planning for what happens if oil goes up to $175 or $200 a barrel. I think it's like $112 now or something. So that would suggest that there might be more economic pain coming down the line. So this messaging part seems to me really important, and I can't for the life of me figure out why we're moving around on it so much.
Yeah, what they've kind of said a lot is, right, they wanted to rid of any nuclear capabilities and their ability to continue, but then we also would hear that they had obliterated that before, and so there have been questions about that, then the conversations about regime change as well. So I hear you, and I've heard a lot of the concerns as well. We've heard it from our senators here in Virginia who have really questioned a lot there. And you do kind of wonder how much of that is factoring in potentially when you have these other things going on, like a partial shutdown and the economy being impacted by everything, to your point that let's take one of these things off the table. All right, we do have a lot more to talk about, because you want to talk about the state of Virginia?
I would love to talk about the state of Virginia.
Let's talk about the state of Virginia, but first let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back here on Live Impact News. Welcome back to Live Impact News on 13 News Now Plus. We are joined by Dr. Leslie Caughell, our political expert from Virginia Wesleyan University, here to talk about, first, the big news we just got overnight with the Senate reaching a deal to end portion of this partial government shutdown. But now let's talk about the big fight here in the Commonwealth of Virginia over congressional maps and redistricting. We are now, I think, 4 weeks officially away from April 21st, which is the day of the referendum vote. And there's been a lot of chatter and a lot of talk from leaders on both sides. We've now heard from, more often from Democratic Governor here, Abigail Spanberger, and now former Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. In just the past week, they put forth their kind of efforts on both sides of this debate. Leslie, let me ask you, right now, at this point, we've seen some of the early numbers, and it looks like a lot of people who are in more Republican-leaning districts have gone out to early vote more than Democratic. Should we read into that at all? What could it mean?
I don't know how much we can take from the early voting numbers, just generally. And these off-year elections are particularly difficult, off-year, just off-cycle special elections. They're really difficult, I think, to make predictions about overall, because different people tend to vote in them than vote in regular elections. And part of what I see all of this money and all of the kind of political star power being spent on is telling people there is an election and trying to get them out. So I think that's really the fight now, which means these early voting numbers are interesting in that they do give us a sense of kind of who's already been mobilized and gotten out there, but they're definitely not the whole story. I think most of the story here is telling Virginians this is something that they can vote on, and then trying to persuade them to vote in your direction and actually get them out on election day.
And for those who are not familiar with what this actual referendum is about, it would allow for the changing of the congressional maps here in Virginia in response to what we've seen in other states, that Republican-led effort, like in Texas and others, to try to change the landscaping of the U.S. Congress. So now Democrats say that they're responding to that here in Virginia. It would make the map for Congress here in Virginia 10-1 leaning, meaning it would favor 10 districts for Democrats and then 1 for Republican. Obviously, Republicans are pushing back against that, and Democrats are really kind of trying to get people, as you said, to go out and vote for it. We just talked messaging a little bit ago when it came to, the messaging beyond the war. Messaging here, just off of your answer there, is so important. We've seen flyers go out that have been very misleading. But have you had any questions or any thoughts about the way in which both sides have been packaging their messaging in getting? Because that's something that I've found interesting, how they've tried to get the message across to voters.
Yeah, so I think there's one thing I found really surprising in the sense that I thought Republicans were a little late to organize around this. And I've been a little surprised by how little national money and attention seems to be going into this campaign. Just especially because I feel like there's probably an argument that you could make at the national level if you're the president about how his Save America, Save USA Act goes along with this as a voting initiative. Wouldn't necessarily agree with the reality of that, but I think as a messaging strategy, it makes sense. But clearly what we see from Republicans, largely Republicans at the state level, is they centered on a strategy that's two things. One, gerrymandering is bad because it's bad for voters and it kind of violates that one person, one vote rule. And the second is it is particularly bad for rural voters in rural areas. And I think this seems to be where you see a lot of the op-ed attention, where you see a lot of the kind of efforts and the resources going around packaging some variation of this message. There were a couple of mailers about this being like the new Jim Crow that were pretty controversial early on. But I see that as their core messaging. Democrats are in kind of a weird position, I think, because Democrats have traditionally not been in the state of Virginia, I think, they were really pushing a lot of this anti-gerrymandering stuff through the state legislature even before it ended up going up through a constitutional referendum. They're kind of in a position where they're like, we've written an amendment that's about allowing gerrymandering, but just this once. At some point it'll stop. So I'm pointing this out because I think there's a way in which you can tell there's some ideological problem with just being vote for gerrymandering and the redrawing of maps here. They're trying to thread a needle with their voters where it's this is a necessary thing to do to counter something else, even if you have to hold your nose to do it in a lot of instances. And I think that's been interesting to see how politicians are doing that. And at least to me, I guess this maybe is commonsensical, but a lot of what they've been doing, I think, is just bringing in really popular Democrats to deliver that message. So I just got a mailer from Barack Obama, right? He's doing commercials. And you see, Abigail Spanberger weighing in on this. Democratic politicians, I think, are talking about this a lot more at the state level. So I think they're really trying to bring out the big guns in the sense of getting people that other Democrats are likely to like and recognize and maybe trust to deliver this message that it's okay to vote for this thing and you need to vote for this thing. It's imperative.
Yeah, I think, from a lot of what I'm reading and people I'm speaking to, it really will come down to, and it sounds like it's common sense, but truly, who can get people to the polls, who can get them to the actual voting booth and to cast their ballot. And so that is going to be the challenge, I think, from both sides of this, which, by the way, we can't forget on the backdrop of it all, we still have to wait to hear from the Virginia Supreme Court, right? Because there's a whole legal battle with all of this, as it being questioned of whether or not it's even legal in the first place. The Virginia Supreme Court saying that it will not really take up that discussion until after the referendum takes place. And so, I guess there could even be a scenario. Various experts, we've had you come on and others say they think that the Supreme Court would likely is kind of signaling they'll go with where the voters go, but there's still the possibility that they could not. And then what does that mean?
I think that would be, for me, if you take out any of the actual legal questions, just from a legitimacy and trust in government perspective, that would be an outcome that would be really concerning, because I think for a lot of voters to see the Supreme Court overturn what voters voted on in the referendum would maybe further entrench the idea that the courts are politicized. I'm not saying that's true.
Yeah.
But I think like that would be a very real ramification of that. So also think of all the money that would have been wasted if we have this election and then that's overturned. I do want to say one other thing. You're, I think, 100% right that this is, every election is about who goes to the polls, but particularly in this one, because this is not people going on the first Tuesday in November, which I think makes the messaging part even more important. Especially because a lot of people don't get up in the morning and think, you know, what's motivating me? Gerrymandering, right? Most people don't have a solid sense of what it is. Even people who follow politics are having a hard time telling why Democrats think it's a bad idea in Texas and a good idea in Virginia. I don't think voters really know what they think about this yet. This gives the parties an opportunity to persuade, but like they've got to get out there. So not only do they have to get people to the polls, they've got to like give them some sense of what they're expecting them to do.
And I think to your point, you talked about again the messaging. It also will boil down to which party, which side of this conversation do you think the messaging is not just simpler but easier? You know, and so I think that's going to be interesting again when we see what happens on April 21st to see who all actually made it to the polls by that point is what I'm waiting to see, because I do think that's what it's really going to boil down to in that. Anything else in that conversation that you think that we should be keeping our eyes on, or that you're kind of really trying to figure out how it lands?
Yeah, so this is just a bigger picture thing. I've had a really hard time trying to figure out with this redistricting stuff, especially as we look at it in Virginia, how the National Republican Party is coordinating itself. And I say this coming from the perspective of, like, you look at political parties as groups of organized interests that are coordinating together to get something. And when you're running in elections, that's to get elected, right? And what that means is there's usually an overarching coordination between the national party leaders, the Senate party leaders, the leaders in the House of Representatives, and then the people at the state level. And I think when I look at Virginia, and particularly when I look at the Republican strategy in Virginia, it seems really discoordinate. So this all started because the president was like, we should do mid-cycle redistricting, right? So he opened this as a thing. Well, now the national party seems kind of out of it. Right, and I think there are a lot of Republicans in the House of Representatives in Virginia who are going to be really at risk when this happens. That are like, whoa, this is really important. I could lose my seat, and I just don't see a lot of coordination at the national party level to figure out a way to kind of message to get voters out in ways that are kind of boost their party going into the election. So I'm not sure what's going on, and it really seems like in some ways party coordination here has broken down, and the president is kind of, you know, maybe calling the shots at a high conceptual level, but then stepping back when it comes to the nuts and bolts of what's going on. And if I were, I don't know, Representative Kagan's, I don't think I would be very happy right now, right? I don't think I would feel very safe. I think it's a really, you know, you can't feel comfortable that the party has your back and is doing everything that they can do to keep your already vulnerable seat from being even more vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to how many things you're juggling at one time, right? Particularly at the national federal level right now. There are so many things that are of the top importance and their attention. You wonder if that's a part of this equation too with this conversation.
Yeah, and I think this is also an artifact too of, you know, whether or not we talk about presidents or party leaders, selecting people that they trust and have a degree of kind of skill and competence in these areas to kind of lead and coordinate, right? So maybe to some extent I'm like, well, maybe what could the president be doing here, or how could the national party be helping more? And I think the real question here is like a capacity, right? Has the Republican Party built enough capacity into the governing structures that they're able to do all these things at once? Because that's part of governing, right? And just to be clear, it's easier for Democrats right now because they don't have to make decisions and they could be the opposition party. It is a lot easier to be like, I don't like something, than to go in and fix it. And we see that all the time. But I think certainly there are a lot of balls being juggled right now. But, maybe one of the problems for the administration is that it doesn't look like there's a particular area, if we look at if we look at numbers that, like, public opinion polls of voter opinions, that they're perceiving the administration to be doing particularly well on.
Well, we'll certainly see. I mean, in context, again, of this referendum for the congressional maps, April 21st is that referendum vote. But right now, the early voting has already begun, I believe, all the way through the 18th of April. So just under a month until we figure out where things land in this entire vote. We already know that there are certain schools in the area, Virginia Beach Public Schools being one of them, that they are going to stop classes on that day so that they can allow for their facilities to be voting locations, polling locations for people. I believe Norfolk Public Schools is also looking at it, and some other school divisions in the area. So all of it is building up for that, and it's certainly going to be whichever way that tide swings, it's going to be huge news here in the Commonwealth of Virginia.